A little further to the south, the Powhatan people occupied much of the area that is now Virginia. It is estimated that between 14,000 and maybe as many as 25,000 lived in eastern Virginia when the English arrived to colonize the area. These tribes had a complex chiefdom, whereby there was a local chief as well as a paramount chief who controlled many different tribes and governed it somewhat like a confederacy. Like the tribes to the north, the Powhatan, which were related to the Algonquin, lived in villages with semi-permanent houses constructed from mats placed over a flexible frame. They practiced agriculture, especially growing maize, but also hunted and fished in their area. As soil productivity would decline and local fish and game were depleted, the tribes would relocate to a new location within a given range. It was tribal cultures like these that the English first encountered when establishing their North American settlements. Societies in the Northwest and present-day California, Northern California, supported themselves by hunting and gathering, and in some areas developed settled communities supported by the vast resources of the ocean. They settled along the shores and rivers and creeks of southeastern Alaska to northern California and fished for the main part of their diet, although hunting and gathering were also practiced. There was very limited agriculture, and as primarily a maritime culture, they were expert canoe builders. Salmon fishing was particularly important, and some tribes hunted whales and other sea mammals. The tribes in this area had managed to develop a high culture without the benefit of extensive agriculture, pottery, or even the influence of the ancient Mexican civilizations. They lived in large, complex communities, constructed multi-family cedar plank houses, some as large as 1,000 feet long. Their society developed a caste system of chiefs, commoners, and slaves. They were also highly skilled in crafts and woodworking that reached their height after European contact, which would provide them with steel tools. They placed an inordinate value on accumulated wealth and property, and families would hold lavish feasts to display their wealth and social status. Many times they would also use elaborately carved totems to indicate social status in the history of a particular family. Some examples from this area include the Chinook, Tlingit, and Tillamook Indian nations. The Age of Discovery, also known as the Age of Exploration, was a period in history starting in the 15th century and continuing until well into the 17th century, and even a little beyond, in which Europeans engaged in intensive exploration of the world, establishing direct contacts with Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania, as well as mapping the planet. Portuguese and the Spanish were the pioneers of this exploration, traveled long distances over open ocean in search of alternative trade routes to the Indies, moved by the trade of gold, silver, and spices. The reason this exploration was happening was due to really many causes, and it would transform the European economy. New technological developments, such as better ships that were larger and more maneuverable, increased trade across Europe. The compass and similar tools allowed for navigation away from coastlines. Better maps, and the spread of those maps via the printing press, would also contribute. Portugal, particularly under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, tried to challenge the hold that the Italian states had on trade across the Mediterranean with the Far East. As luxuries had been flowing in via the Middle East into Europe since after the Crusades. With the Italians in control of the Mediterranean, the Portuguese, who focused their efforts of going around Africa, achieving that goal by 1485, when the Spanish joined in, they had nowhere else to go except west. With funding provided by Isabella of Castile, Christopher Columbus was able to undertake a voyage to the west with the goal of reaching India or China. What Columbus underestimated was the size of the Earth, and therefore how long it would actually take to reach the Indies, believing it was as little as 2,300 miles. His men were near mutiny when he sighted land in the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. He discovered Cuba as well as other islands in the West Indies, returning to Spain, and then back looking for India or China, and he was followed by many others, both exploring on behalf of Spain as well as other nations. John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto, representing England, though he was born in Genoa, reached Belle Island on the northern coast of Newfoundland in June of 1497. He sailed down the east coast of Newfoundland and then eventually returned to England by the end of July that same year. His was the fastest crossing of the Atlantic for more than a century. A second expedition was sent out with many more men and ships, but it disappeared somewhere in the North Atlantic and was never heard from again. Still, although they didn't participate in the exploration and settlement of the New World for nearly a century, Cabot's initial voyage would stake England's claim to the area. Juan Ponce de Leon, representing Spain, would set sail from Puerto Rico in 1513 in search of the Fountain of Youth, which was the Europeans' only explanation for why Native Americans appeared so young and did not grow facial hair. He sighted Florida and claimed it for Spain, landing on an inlet near Daytona Beach. He did also discover an extremely strong current, called Gulf Stream, that would force his ships that were sailing south actually in a backwards direction. He sailed eventually down the coast of Florida, past the Florida Keys, and then even up the western coast. Returning home, he skirted the Yucatan Peninsula and passed the north coast of Cuba before returning to Puerto Rico. Giovanni de Verrazzano, representing France, made landfall in 1524 at Cape Fear, the southernmost of North Carolina's 3 capes. He sailed south for over 100 miles before turning around to avoid running into any Spaniards, and then sailed along the coast, exploring the coasts of Georgia and the Carolinas, and even as far north as New York Bay and Arcadia, which is an island up near Newfoundland. His voyage, where he's claiming land on behalf of France, would represent a significant challenge to the New World dominance of the Spanish. In 1527, Panfilo Narvaez, representing Spain, obtained a commission to colonize all the lands between Florida and Mexico. With a force of 260 men, he landed in Florida near St. Petersburg, sent his ships on to Mexico, and marched up the coast. Traveling northward, though, he battled the Native Americans who were hostile to his presence all the way. He managed to cross the Pensacola Bay, still constantly engaged in warfare, eventually reaching the Mississippi River, where all of the boats would be lost, and Native Americans captured or killed all of the expedition except for 4 men, one of them being a man by the name of Cabeza de Vaca, who would take over the expedition. The 4 survivors continued to walk along the coast all the way to Texas and then eventually to Mexico, finally receiving help from friendly Native Americans who provided food for them along the way. Eventually, in 1536, de Vaca and the other survivors reached Mexico City. It had taken them 9 years. In 1534, Jacques Cartier, representing France, would make landfall at Newfoundland. Sailing around that coast, as well as Labrador and Arcadia and many of the other islands, he discovered the area of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, sailed up the St. Lawrence River, and arrived at what is now Quebec by the fall of that year. He even reached as far inland as the present-day city of Montreal. He wintered in the region and then returned to France, setting a precedent for the French claim to this eastern portion of Canada. He would return in 1541 with the intent of colonizing Canada, establishing a settlement at Quebec, and setting up a French fur trade. Hernando de Soto, representing Spain, landed near Fort Myers, Florida in 1539 with a force of 570 men and 223 horses. De Soto, influenced by Pizarro's actions in Peru, had no respect for the indigenous population of Florida, and his basic strategy was to enter an Indian town, capture the chief, demand wealth and provisions, and then move on to the next village, capturing that chief and releasing the chief of the first village. During his expedition, De Soto also had the goal of killing as many Native Americans as he could wherever he went. He and his men marched northward from Florida into Georgia, into Alabama and Tennessee. Near present-day Memphis, he and his men would build barges and cross the Mississippi River, crossing into Arkansas and then Oklahoma before returning back to the Mississippi River, where De Soto died of a fever in 1542. His men continued the expedition, eventually sailing down the Mississippi and across the Gulf of Mexico, concluding their journey in 1543 with slightly more than half of the original 570 men. Part of what they had been looking for was a large Inca-style civilization, which they did not find. Although the Portuguese had mostly concentrated on exploring the coast of Africa, the discovery of the Americas led to significant disputes between them and Spain, eventually being settled by the Treaty of Tordesillas, which would divide the world between the two nations along a line of latitude located approximately down the center of the North Atlantic. The agreement had actually started out as a papal bull or decree by the Spanish-born Pope Alexander VI in 1493. After complaints by Portugal that they didn't have enough territory or room at sea for even their African endeavors, the line was moved to almost 1,200 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands in the treaty, which was negotiated by representatives from both Spain and Portugal, and then was eventually approved by the Pope anyway. The new boundary would enable Portugal to claim the coast of Brazil after its discovery by Pedro Alvarez Cabral in 1500. After Columbus's trips to America, future voyages would begin a cultural exchange of plants, of animals, of goods, and even diseases between the Old and the New Worlds. This is called the Columbian Exchange. And by the Old World, we don't just mean Europe, but the entire Eastern Hemisphere would gain from this Columbian Exchange in a number of ways. Discoveries of new supplies of metals are perhaps the best known, the gold and the silver. But the Old World would also gain new staple crops such as potatoes, sweet potatoes, and maize. Less calorie-intensive foods like tomatoes and chili peppers, cacao, peanuts, and pineapples were also introduced and are now culinary centerpieces in many Old World countries, namely Italy, Greece, and other Mediterranean countries for tomatoes, India and Korea for chili peppers, Hungary for paprika, which is made from chili peppers, and Malaysia and Thailand, which are known for using chili peppers, peanuts, and even pineapples. Tobacco, another New World crop, was so universally adopted that it came to be used as a substitute for currency in many parts of the world. The exchange also dramatically increased the availability of many Old World crops, such as sugar, coffee, and rice, which were particularly well suited for the soils of the New World. The New World also saw the introduction of beasts of burden, animals that were large enough to transport goods or to be used in agriculture, including cattle, oxen, donkeys, and horses. Animals suitable for meat were also introduced, including pigs, chickens, goats, and sheep. The Old World received some animals as well, including the turkey, the llama, the alpaca, and even the guinea pig.